Hi there, welcome to this short presentation entitled The PhD Journey, The Experience of an Apprentice Wordsmith by myself, David Potter. The purpose of this brief presentation is to give the viewer an idea of what's involved when one does a PhD. Here are some facts about the PhD process. First of all, it's your PhD, it's nobody else's PhD. Only yourself is responsible for completing it, nobody else. Be prepared to sacrifice 15 hours per week for at least 5 years. This is a major time commitment. Forget about leisure time as you used to know leisure time. Your leisure time will become your PhD time. Always bear in mind when you do a PhD you're on the thin end of a power equation with your supervisors, and what I mean by that is that at the end of the day you will not get your PhD unless you manage your relationship with your supervisor extremely well and keep them on your side. Avoid faculty politics at all costs. Don't get involved in any negative background conversations about other lecturers or other PhD students, because you're likely to find yourself in trouble. And if you can, try and avoid the big traumas in life, such as divorce, moving jobs, and yes, I'm afraid, try and avoid intense love affairs because they tend to be emotionally and intellectually draining. And finally, at all costs, try and avoid changing supervisors during the PhD journey, otherwise you may find yourself a PhD orphan. Some more facts about your PhD. Get used to feeling isolated. Unfortunately, the PhD is not a particularly sociable process. Other than your loved ones and probably your supervisor, nobody cares if you complete a PhD, and that's one of the big tests about it. You're not wearing a pair of fashionable Nike trainers or driving a trendy car that everybody wants in the capitalist world. You're actually pursuing a degree that most of the people most of the time are not actually interested in. Nobody fails a PhD. This isn't like going to sit in one exam and you either pass or you fail. You either complete the PhD or you don't, and it may take you 3 years full-time, 5 years part-time, or in some cases 8 to 10 years. It's important to remember that 30% of your behaviour in a PhD is expressive, and what I mean by that is the classic management behaviour of looking busy. I'm afraid 70% of it has to be substantive, i.e. you need to do the work. Thinking on paper intellectually is actually very difficult, and once you start trying to think on paper, and particularly when your thinking is being tested against academic rigour, that could be a very stressful situation. You need to learn the language of your academic subject. You need to learn the jargon and become eloquent and fluent in that jargon. And I would ask you to bear in mind that a thesis is fundamentally an argument. From the very first word at the very start of your PhD to the very last word when you come to your summation, you're actually presenting and progressing an argument. You have to make a decision early on in your PhD whether you're going to concentrate on the journals or the books. Personally, I like to do the books in the first couple of years to get the real background on the theoretical subject, and then in the last 3 years of my PhD I focused on the journals. You need to bear in mind that academic writing is a very particular style of writing, and it's actually very tough to do it well, but it will come with practice. And also the academic rigour that you need to get a PhD also requires practice and self-discipline. And last but not least, don't avoid the research philosophy. Things like the research curriculum, ontology, epistemology, and things like that. You need to get to grips with these concepts if you want to get your PhD. As I said, you need to develop theoretical epistemology and ontological compatibility with your supervisors. This is a bit like a religion. You're either a Protestant or you're a Catholic. There's no point going to a Protestant church if you're Catholic, or going to a Catholic church if you're Protestant. The same thing applies to a PhD. If your PhD supervisor believes in a positivistic ontology and you believe in a much more subjective, symbolic, interpretivist ontology, there's no point hooking up with them as a supervisor. And the other thing is, 3 years into your PhD process, let's say you're part-time, you really don't want to fall out with your supervisor, because as I said, you'll become a PhD orphan. You have to bear in mind that the PhD gets created in the furnace of your mind. This is a hot, searing process. And here's an image of a master samurai sword maker burning and melting the raw materials to make the samurai sword, and this is no different to what you're going to do with the PhD. Except in a PhD, ideas and text are your raw materials. Just as when you're making the samurai sword, the raw materials are steel. And when you're doing the PhD, your anvil is your keyboard. Just like when the samurai sword maker is making his sword, the anvil is his anvil. And from the pounding of raw text and the fusion of ideas comes form. And the pounding of raw text and the fusion of ideas takes place in the furnace of your mind, and you belt it out on the anvil that is your keyboard. And through time, with constant polishing, you start creating form. Polishing and shaping of form produces a unique object. In the case of the samurai sword maker, it's the samurai sword. However, you have to bear in mind when you're doing your PhD that perfection is a fool's errand, even if the master craftsman has to settle for a standard. And as you can see in this image, the master craftsman as the samurai sword maker can look at the fantastic piece of work that he's created over 5 years, but only he or she can actually see the flaws, but they have to settle at one point, and so do you when you do your PhD. And that's the end of this short presentation on a PhD journey. I hope you find it interesting. Thank you very much.